Let's give a very warm Chicago welcome to Jeremy McCarter.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm excited to talk a little bit about my experience with the show and with these two books I've worked on, and then to take some of your questions and hear what else you'd like to know. I'm very glad to be here. I have to say that visiting this place always feels to me like I'm visiting the future. You don't need me to say it, but you guys live in the middle of an immense construction zone. Every time I come to the West Loop, it feels like there's another building gone and another one going up in its place. And it invites you, it practically forces you to think about the future and how there's some patch of sky pretty soon that's going to be a window through which someone can look down on me as I go back and forth in front of your building trying to find the front door. It also feels like the future because of what happens here at Google. And I don't just mean the space age sort of realness in that lobby downstairs. Also, I don't just mean the practice of having a peer bonus, which I just found out about. But I want to be the future. I mean, out there, all of us are getting the hang of the 21st century. It feels like in here, you guys are busy creating the 22nd. However, I am just old enough to remember a time when there wasn't a Google. I remember this moment when I had to ask somebody, what is Google? Because I thought it was a number. And someone had to explain to me, well, it's like Yahoo or Lycos, but it knows what you're looking for. And I remember at the time thinking that was really cool and maybe sort of creepy. In the face of all this newness, I feel like an emissary from oldness. The work that I do is in old formats. I write books, which have been around for a long time. And if you're talking about the format of book that some of you are holding right now, then theater, which is the other place where I hang out, is even older than books. 2,500 years ago, on the side of a hill in Athens, some gentlemen in togas invented tragedy. They put on plays to explore the political, the moral, and the religious dilemmas that puzzled them while they did the other thing that they were doing in Athens 2,500 years ago, which was inventing democracy. The origins of theater weren't all super somber and weighty because those day-long tragic festivals ended with satyr plays. If you know your theater history, you know that they are sort of blindingly filthy, sort of cavalcades of dick jokes, essentially. And in the theater today, we do our best to honor both of those traditions. When I received the invitation to give a talk at Google, this interesting space between the old and the new seemed like something to explore, particularly how we get from the old to the new, how change happens. It's been on my mind lately because I feel like I've been getting an advanced degree in change studies because of my connection to Hamilton. I feel very fortunate to have been around my friend Lin-Manuel's musical in its early stages and its middle stages, and especially its late stages, because the late stages were the cast parties. At one of those parties, on the opening night of the off-Broadway run at the Public Theater, Lin asked me to collaborate on a book about the show. The essays and the profiles and things that I wrote for it are all at heart a way to try to catch change as it's happening. Change in the possibilities of an art form that goes back to those dudes in togas, change in the lives of the artists that I'd spent a couple of years getting to know and love, even change in the society that has just been offered a new way to think about itself and who belongs there. The Hamilton phenomenon has become so potent, it seems to me, that we could look to it as a kind of case study in how a certain kind of change, real red letter day before and after change, can come from all sorts of surprising places. Now, to be sure, this is just one guy's view. I have no official, edict that I can declare here. And even then, it's only going to be a progress report. The best metaphor I've come up with for spending 5 years very close to Hamilton is that it's like living in a science fiction movie. But it's one that doesn't seem to be ending and that somehow keeps getting stranger the longer it goes. As I said, I tried to explore some of these questions in the book. A book that some unknown fan on Twitter did us the favor of calling the Hamiltome, which is really cool and has stuck now for a long time. So thank you, anonymous fan, if you're watching. I want to push a little further on some of those questions today about Hamilton, about what it means, what it helps us understand about change. But I also want to add, for the first time today, something new. I want to talk about how I came by that perspective on Hamilton, why I was so attuned to the changes that I was seeing in the first place, and what I think it means for our society. It's a coincidence, but it's one for which that I'm always going to be grateful. During the same years that I was watching Lin and those bold and brilliant artists try to create something new, I was immersed in the lives of some bold and brilliant radicals who were trying to change American society 100 years ago. In these sunny days right before World War I, these young idealists had the feeling that the world was spinning their way, and maybe faster than it had ever spun before. And they left their colleges, and they wanted to try to make it spin even faster in the direction of their ideals: economic equality, women's rights, social and cultural liberation. They were confident about the prospects of American life in a way that few people before or since have been confident. And then, and maybe this will sound familiar from your life lately, they found out one bewildering day that they had it all wrong. The world wasn't spinning their way. On the contrary, when the United States gave up its neutrality and declared war on Germany in 1917, the country went mad. It became open season on young radicals, but these 5 people that I'm writing about kept trying to change the world anyway. So at the same time I was watching Lin and his collaborators dramatize the founding of the country, I was writing a book about people trying to make America live up to those founders' ideals and what that struggle cost them. The book I wrote is nonfiction. I didn't make it up. I couldn't have made it up. And it's called Young Radicals. Lin and I wrote the Hamilton in what I thought was going to be a brief and heavily caffeinated break from writing Young Radicals. The caffeine part turned out to be right. We only had 6 months to write the book that you're holding, Lin to annotate his lyrics, and me to write the chapters. But at the end, looking back on it, I see that it wasn't a break from Young Radicals, that these 2 ways of looking at America and how change happens are completely intertwined. Both books are aspects of one big exploration about the way America has changed, is changing, and still has the capacity to change. Both were written by performing the same essential action. It's as if I stood on one of those street corners outside your building and looked at that patch of sky and watched the buildings come down and watched the new ones go up, try to make sense of the skyline. How did this get here, and what does it mean? All these questions, I have to say, look a little different than they did to me even a couple of months ago. The election, I think, has given everybody, no matter their politics, a new sense of how quickly and drastically the world can turn upside down, as Lin puts it in the show. I have no idea what's coming. Nobody does. But I think we're all going to have to become experts pretty quickly in change studies if we're going to keep up with what's coming our way. I also have to say I feel increasingly sure that we should take a lesson from those guys in togas and consider the possibility that even a play has something to tell us and maybe to help us about our democracy. So before I go any further, I want to get a sense of the room, of your Hamilton awareness, or fandom, or obsession, as the case may be. By show of hands, who has seen the show so far? That's a lot. Google, you are on the ball. Who has tickets to see it but hasn't gone yet? All right, no spoilers then today. Who's listened to the cast album? Some hands did not go up. Who has listened to the cast album today? All right. Who finds themselves carving out time to listen to the cast album when they should be doing other stuff? Washington on your side, am I right? You've got company. One of the reasons it's worth talking about this show in some detail is because it is uniquely an event in all of our lives. The cast recording has now gone double platinum. That's impressive, but what's crazy is that that cast album of a Broadway musical, is currently the #2 album on the country's rap charts. Crazier still is that it's only the #2 album on the charts because the #1 album on the charts is the Hamilton mixtape, which is the covers and the songs inspired by that same Broadway musical. So seriously, what is going on? Nobody could have predicted this would happen, and even after all these years of trying, I'm still not sure that I can explain it. And this is after years of being around it. And in fact, I should try to explain, I guess, how exactly I got to be in this position to have such a good vantage point in the first place. Back in 2007, I was writing for New York Magazine. I had written repeatedly and in retrospect somewhat obnoxiously about my hopes for hip-hop as a way of telling stories in the theater. I started one of those essays once, "Hip-hop can save the theater, I am not kidding." So once you start an essay like that, then you've committed yourself to seeing everything that comes along that might potentially prove your point one way or the other. So in the spring of 2007, I went to see a show, a musical, by people I'd never heard of. Within 5 minutes of it starting, I knew that I had encountered an artist who was thinking about these things the same way that I was. The show was In the Heights. It was Lin-Manuel's first musical in New York. I wrote something that tried to explain why I was so taken with the show and why I thought it was a big deal. Lin, reading it, had the same sense of recognition that I had had when I was sitting there in the theater that night. So the show's publicist fixed us up. The very first conversation that we ever had, late on a night in the summer of 2008, he told me about this idea that he had. He was reading a book by Ron Chernow, and it had given him an idea to make a hip-hop mixtape about the life of Alexander Hamilton. I told him that was a crazy idea. At least I think that's what I told him. We both drank so much that night that neither of us is entirely clear on what we talked about. But I think I said that because I still think it's the case, that it's a crazy idea, even if it's a great idea. And I think one of the little lessons about Hamilton is sometimes it's the crazy idea that changes the world. Well, that's how I got the before view of what was coming. Here's how I got the during view of what was happening along the way. When the change that was happening was in the workshops and the rehearsal rooms. A few years after that hazy night, in the summer of 2011, I was on the artistic staff of the Public Theater in New York. Part of my job at the Public was to bring in artists and propose projects that might be right for our season. So I said to my boss, Oscar Eustace, my friend, that we should bring in my pal Lin, who had told me that he had this Hamilton idea. He had performed one song at the White House, and then no one had heard anything about it for 2 years. Let's see what's going on. Now, I love Oscar, and I was planning on taking this story to the grave, but he tells it for a laugh, so why shouldn't I? When I suggested this to Oscar, his response was to say no. You see, when In the Heights won its 4 Tony Awards, it did so at the expense of a show that Oscar had developed at the Public. So I persisted and convinced him that he should at least meet the guy, let me set up an introduction. I emailed Lin, I told him how thrilled my boss would be to meet him. And they met and they hit it off quickly and I think for life. It would take another 2 years for Oscar and the show's lead commercial producer, Jeffrey Seller, to make the arrangements for the show to have its world premiere at the Public. But what it meant was, in the intervening time, I was around to watch those changes that were necessary for it to become the thing that has now taken over the world. Or to use the phrase that was in my introduction today and that is apparently going to be carved on my tombstone, I was in the room where it happened. When something turns out to be as successful and as influential as Hamilton, it's easy to think that it must have been inevitable. It wasn't inevitable. Watching that process helps to understand what it takes if you're going to make something that's going to change the game, that's going to change the world. Lin's work on Hamilton represents one of the greatest individual achievements in the American theater. He had the idea for it, he wrote the music, he wrote the lyrics, he wrote the libretto, he played the lead. There are very few examples of that happening ever around Broadway. This man is plainly a genius. And when I say that, I don't just mean that he's someone who has a brain full of certain arcane information. There are better words for somebody like that, an expert or a nerd. And Lin is a nerd, but that's not what I mean here. I use the word genius to describe him because he wasn't just finding new answers to the old questions, he was finding new questions. In 2008, there weren't a lot of people walking around New York trying to figure out how to use hip-hop to tell the story of America's founding. There weren't many people who thought the only way to tell a story about America was to skim the cream off all of the cultural styles that we have, try to make them cohere to tell one funny and frequently heartbreaking story. But Lin's genius can't fully explain what happened, how they did it. There's a paradox in the making of Hamilton. There are 2 things that seem incompatible, but in fact are completely dependent on each other to work. Lin's single-handed achievement is also one of the great collaborations in recent theater history, at minimum. Lin worked with a core group of collaborators that he calls his cabinet. He watched a lot of The West Wing. He calls them his cabinet. The director, Tommy Kail, the choreographer, Andy Blankenbuehler, and the orchestrator, Alex Lacamoire. These guys seem to share a brain that moves unbelievably quickly. It's like one of those West Wing conversations where they're walking and talking at the same time on fast forward. Watching them work has actually helped me understand the founders, the people that they were dramatizing a little better. The way that complementary personalities, people pushing and pulling on each other, make it possible for a group to do something unprecedented and what had seemed to be impossible. For those really gifted individuals in both eras, what they shared was a spirit of ruthless experimentation. They were trying things, they were throwing them out, they were trying something new, until all the various contributions they were bringing into the room with them added up to create something, some version of what they had started out to create. Now, watching this and trying to make sense of what I was seeing was helped along, this is one of those ways, by the work that I was doing simultaneously on Young Radicals. It helped me to understand this deeper point about change. One of the things I loved best about the years I spent on Young Radicals was getting to marinate in the thought and the work of William James. Does that name mean anything to anybody? William James was a medical doctor who became one of the first psychologists in America by the turn of the 20th century. He was the leading philosopher in the country. He grasped at a time when people were getting used to the idea that there were no eternal certainties, there's no divine plan that's leading us to where we're going, that this might not be terrifying. This might actually be liberating. There's no eternal truth that we're trying to find. There's no perfect show that you're going to discover. You have to make it as best you can. And here's what he said. What really exists is not things made, but things in the making. There's a whole worldview in that. What really exists is not things made, but things in the making. In other words, we should get in the habit, all of us, of thinking that change, not stasis, is the norm. There's a reason why James was such a big inspiration to the Young Radicals at the turn of the 20th century. He was encouraging them to think it was worth it to fight and to struggle and to sacrifice for the sake of their ideals. Because if nothing is fixed and finished, if everything is still in the making, then what we do may contribute to that change, and maybe it contributes in a way that makes a difference. Well, that was certainly what I saw in the rehearsals and the workshops and the script meetings. Lin and his cabinet and the actors all contributing their piece to the creation of something that wasn't going to be perfect, because perfect doesn't mean anything in this case, but it would be the most fully realized version of itself that it was possible for it to be. But if a show is a thing that's in the making, so are the hearts and the minds of the people who are involved in making it. The effect flows both ways. As you know, if you've seen it or know anything about it, one of the most striking things about Hamilton is that the founders are played by people of color. As Tommy Kail said, the director, it's a story about America then, told by America now, a multicultural 21st century democracy. That meant something to the men and women who were creating it. Daveed Diggs, the insanely charismatic actor who, I see you nodding, Daveed, who created Lafayette and Jefferson, said the experience of playing those men and being in this show made him feel American in a way that he never had before, not after one too many times of getting pulled over by the cops in Oakland for no reason. Leslie Odom Jr., who won a Tony Award for creating the role of Aaron Burr, said that stepping into the shoes of that man and understanding them from that side made the story of America feel like his story in a way that it hadn't before. But they were just putting on costumes, right? I mean, it was just make-believe. It wasn't real. But I think what we begin to see is there are ways that these make-believe situations can have a real effect in the world. Now, most of us, I would say just about all of us, unless you are more talented than even I can imagine, won't have the experience of performing Hamilton for ourselves, outside of our showers, our cars, and these Hamilton sing-alongs that happen. Do you know about the Hamilton sing-alongs? Some people are nodding, but not like you. So there are these sing-alongs where people get together around a piano and literally they just stand there with strangers singing the songs from Hamilton, which I think is pretty great, actually. And if I could sing, I'd probably do it. If there's a change that's worth talking about around this show, it's going to be the change that we receive when we watch it or when we hear it. And here again, it helps to think about William James. Nothing is made, everything is in the making. Our brains are always in the making. I mean, we know from social science that it's not like this thing that you're carrying around in your skull is sort of fixed and it's moving in one direction and you can focus on what you want to focus on all the time. The design of a hospital room can affect how quickly people recover from surgery. Exposure to certain colors can make you more or less creative, more or less calm. It can affect your circulation. Up-tempo music can make you work out longer or harder, which I guess is why there are so many spin classes now that use Hamilton songs. That to me doesn't seem like a great idea, because if the wrong song comes on, that's over. That class it's going to be a lot of ugly crying and not a lot of exercise. It seems pretty clear that something is happening to us when we're sitting there for 2.5 hours watching this show. I mean, the alternative that we somehow put our brains on lock and nothing affects us just doesn't make any sense. The question, I guess, is, do the changes that happen to us in that time, do they matter? Are they significant enough for us to think about, to study? Could the experience of a play or a novel or any kind of imaginative experience matter enough amid all the other things that are changing us and the way we think and what we do every day? I think that they do matter. It would be kind of perverse to be this far into this talk and then be like, no, actually, let's just go back to our desks now. But I don't want you to take my opinion for this. I want us to look at this very important question from the perspective of theory and the perspective of practice. And to do it, I need a volunteer. Who wants to come up here and talk with me? Yeah, I know you want to do it, but who wants to? Yes, you, come up here. Yes, yes, come up. This is going to be awesome. I hope you can sing. No, I'm totally kidding. No, that's all right. There's no singing.
I'll sing.
Okay, no. What's your name?
Alex.
Alex, hi. Okay,
Nice
you get some prep time. Hi. This is what I want you to read this, okay? It's like 3 super long sentences. So
Okay.
you can sit over there and like read it and figure out like where to breathe because it's
great.
super crazy. While I tell them a story, and then when I'm done with the story, I'm gonna call you up and you're gonna do it.
Okay.
All right, Alex, everybody, she's on deck. Seriously, I just don't want someone to black out because you'll see. All right, so we're gonna come back to that, but first I wanna tell this story. It's a story I wish more people knew. Like most stories about the essential meaning of American life, it's a story about Star Trek. One Saturday night in 1966, when the original TV series was on the air, Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura, went to a fundraiser in Beverly Hills. The host of the event told her that a fan of the show was desperate to meet her. So she stood up and turned around, and walking towards her was the fan, Dr. Martin Luther King. He called himself a Trekkie. He told her that it was the only show that he and Coretta allowed the children stay up past their bedtime to see. She told him that she wished she could be out in the street marching with him, and he said, no. We don't need you to march. You are marching. You are reflecting what we are fighting for. She thanked him, and she told him how much she was going to miss her co-stars, because as it happened, a couple of days before this, she had told Gene Roddenberry, the creator of the show, that she was going to leave. She wanted to pursue her dream in a Broadway musical. Dr. King said that she couldn't do that. He said, for the first time on television, we will be seen as we should be seen every day, as intelligent, quality, beautiful people who can sing and dance, yes, but who can go into space, who can be lawyers and teachers, who can be professors, who are in this day, yet you don't see it on television until now. She stayed, of course, and that's one reason why at the end of her association with the show, she became such a valuable resource to NASA, where she helped the space agency find candidates for the astronaut program, especially women and people of color. Now, if Dr. King thought there was a special value to seeing the way people are depicted on television in a show about tribbles, even at the expense of not having a high-profile person walking with him in a march, I am inclined to agree with him. That's the practice part of this. Now I want to get the theory. Alex, you ready for this? All right, it's the play within the play. Here we go. Now, what you're about to hear is from my favorite political philosopher, Walt Whitman. He did not teach political science. He was a poet. He rode buses. He declaimed Shakespeare to people. He was super into the manly love of comrades. He also liked to write really long sentences, which is why I wanted Alex to have, because we're going to hear 3 sentences that are to this point, and we're going to go keep going. All right, Alex, everybody, here we go.
To the ostent of the senses and eyes, I know the influences which stamp the world's history are wars, uprisings, or downfalls of dynasties, changeful movements of trade, important inventions, navigation, military or civil governments, advent of powerful personalities, conquerors, etc. These, of course, play their part, yet it may be a single new thought, imagination, abstract principle, even literary style, fit for the time, put in shape by some great literatus, and projected among mankind, may duly cause changes, growths, removals, greater than the longest and bloodiest war, or the most stupendous, merely political, dynastic, or commercial overturn. In short, as, though it may not be realized, it is strictly true that a few first-class poets, philosophers, and authors have substantially settled and given status to the entire religion, education, law, sociology, etc. of the hitherto civilized world by tingling and often creating the atmospheres out of which they have arisen. Such also must stamp, and more than ever stamp, the interior and real democratic construction of this American continent, today and days to come.
Thank you. That was awesome.
you.
Thank you so much. That is going to be amazing on your clip reel. So I think Dr. King and Walt Whitman are making a version of the same point. which is that ideas and creative expressions have a certain power. They can change the spiritual weather, and by doing so, they can change the world. We know what a hurricane looks like the one that's dramatized in Hamilton, and it's very exciting and all the furniture gets thrown around. And then there's another kind of change that we're not as good at detecting. The storm comes and goes, and we think, well, that's over, we've survived it, life is going to continue the way that it has always gone before. Meanwhile, all the time, the tide is going in and out, season after season, and it's slowly remaking the shore. It's picking up a beach from over here, and it's putting it down over there. It's creating a swamp, or it's draining one. A storm, something that's sudden and abrupt and that changes everything rapidly, that's one kind of change. That's a war or an invasion, or maybe it's an election. The slow action of the tide, year after year, the little changes, that's culture. That's what Dr. King and Walt Whitman are talking about. And in the 21st century, we are all learning about how powerful the rising tides can be. So what is this big change that Hamilton might be affecting? How is it changing the spiritual weather? This is not something that I saw when Lynn and I started work on the book. I wanted the book to tell the story of two revolutions. There's the one that's dramatized in the show, the American Revolution of the 18th century. But the show itself is a revolution. It's changing the way that this art form that goes back to the dudes in togas sounds. It changed the lives of the people who worked on it. I set up the book so that you could follow both of those revolutions in tandem. You watch the arc of the show as it goes through the 18th century revolution, and alongside those chapters tell the story of the revolution of the show, from when Lynn performed at the White House until opening night on Broadway, and then the epilogue, which we had to throw in super quick at the end when President Obama decided to come back to Broadway. And here's what I discovered, is that those two revolutions, the 18th century revolution and whatever the show is doing to us now, are actually aspects of the same revolution. It's about the way we think about America and our place in it. Do you know how the British thought they were going to beat us in the war? They thought it was going to be easy. They would just divide us and we would fall apart. There's no way that 13 fractious colonies could hang together long enough to defeat the most powerful military in the world. That just wasn't going to happen. Well, Hamilton was there at George Washington's elbow for the war, and somehow they prevailed. That was national miracle number one. National miracle number two was meeting the same challenge, or a version of it, a few years later. How do you craft a government that is going to allow those 13 colonies, that are now 13 equal states, to collaborate and to provide order and security? When the fight to ratify the Constitution was underway, Alexander Hamilton was there again. He gave a speech in Poughkeepsie rejecting the notion that what he called the interests, the habits, and the manners of the 13 colonies were too different for them to come together. He said, and I quote, "Under the regular and gentle influence of general laws, these varying interests will be constantly assimilating till they embrace each other and assume the same complexion." As someone put it in our own time a little more eloquently, the things that unite us are stronger than the things that divide us. What seems to me, even now, the most incredible thing about this show is the breadth of the people who have embraced it. Students and teachers, rappers and poets, historians and athletes, all of you. I can't tell you how many different kinds of audience I've spoken to at this point. It looks like every kind of America you can imagine. And at the end, I get the same questions, I get the same looks of enthusiasm, people laugh at the same stuff about the show. It's connecting people in a way in ways that we're not used to people being connected. Michelle Obama called it, and I quote, she actually said this, she called it the best piece of art in any form that I have ever seen in my life, close quote. Dick Cheney also liked it. By the way, do you know what Lynn said after Cheney came to see it? Lynn called Cheney the other vice president who shot his friend. So we all know that recently the show has become divisive in a way that it hadn't been before. To me, that doesn't disprove the essential point. Look, everything in American life is divisive. Our fast food choices are politicized. Our choice of hot caffeinated beverages is supposed to reflect something about our souls. The music we listen to, the movies we like to see. it's not disqualifying to say that Hamilton is contentious sometimes to some people. What seems important to me is that in a country that has for its entire history been trying to find common ground, this is one of the forces that is giving us common ground. Lin just said this in an interview, actually right about where I needed him to, so it would fit right into this spot. Someone asked him in an interview just in the last couple of days, well, what is the message of the show? And this is what he said of the audience: "You may have all gone away with different conclusions of it, but you all watched the same thing together." That's the important thing. When writing the book, I asked Questlove if he could explain its appeal. He told me it reminded him of Thriller. He said that when Michael Jackson's masterpiece came out in 1983, it made kids stop calling him racial slurs on the playground at school. He also said that if anyone else had compared a Broadway musical to the most popular album ever recorded, that he would call it hyperbole. Although, to be fair, this is before he produced the mixtape, which is currently the #1 album in any genre in the country. Hamilton creates a crossroads, a way for different kinds of people to find each other and realize that they might share more than they thought they did, particularly the founding of their country. It's a kind of a beacon, maybe that's a better metaphor. It's a way that it's something you can see from a long way off, and you can navigate yourself towards it. And here again, this is something that I feel like I can see more clearly because of the time I've spent around the story of the Young Radicals. The Young Radicals, the book, is a story about people who want to get free from all the restrictions of 19th century life. The economic servitude, the restrictions on what women could do, the idea that Americanness is a very narrow category. They rebelled, but they rebelled together. They didn't go to a cabin in the woods. They found people who agreed with them and tried to change the system as one. So you have women agitating for the vote by linking arms in a way that they never had before, using the power they already had to try to get what they wanted. They were begged for their votes instead of begging for their votes. You have artists joining forces with workers to publicize strikes, to put on a pageant, to try to make sure that workers feel a sense of solidarity with the artists and the intellectuals and vice versa. There was a sense of solidarity in those years that Walt Whitman would have admired. You just heard what Alex said. But of course he would have, because Whitman was inspiring them to do those things that they did. The fullest expression of this point I'm trying to make comes from one of those young radicals whose name is Randolph Bourne. I don't imagine anyone's going to know the name Randolph Bourne. He was a brilliant writer and a talented musician, and he had a sad, short life. When he was born, the doctor botched the delivery, so his face was disfigured for his entire life. When he was young, he had an illness that left him with a hunchback, and he was only 5 feet tall, and yet his friends loved him. He wrote the most amazing and beautiful letters. There are stories about him setting up shop in a Greenwich Village cafe and spending hours and hours of getting people to debate one another. A huge and luminous personality. Bourne understood better than anybody else at his time, and better than almost anybody now, how American life was changing, what it meant to be an American in the modern era, which we can say from the Civil War on. He knew that it was no longer possible to talk about what was called the melting pot. And we think of the melting pot as a good thing, but what it meant back then, the melting pot, is that people would come to this country and all of their distinctive ethnic traits would be boiled away, and that you would come out the other side of it being an American, which would mean essentially what white Anglo-Saxon character, what Americanness had supposedly been from the beginning. Bourne knew that was false, and here's the leap he made. He knew it was better for American democracy that it was false. He knew that the nationalities that came to this country were remaining intact, which meant that this country was, for the first time in history, a transnational nation. He was a multiculturalist before that word existed. He knew that a dynamic country that was still young, even 140 years after Alexander Hamilton's time, could only fulfill its destiny if all of those nationalities had a way to fulfill it together. So he used a term that he'd read in a book by a colleague of William James. His name was Josiah Royce, called the beloved community. The beloved community is a place where all would come together in mutual love and companionship. They'd be joined by their loyalty to themselves and to something larger than themselves. They would find fulfillment through acting together. This is what Bourne said. All our idealisms must be those of future social goals in which all can participate. The good life of personality lived in the environment of the beloved community. No mere doubtful triumphs of the past, which redound to the glory of only one of our transnationalities, can satisfy us. It must be a future America on which all can unite, which pulls us irresistibly toward it, as we understand each other more warmly. The lesson of those young radicals 100 years ago, in all their struggles, that I carried into Hamilton, and what I saw in the creation of Hamilton in our time, and what I saw reflected back to the founding of the country, I can put very succinctly. That lesson, what I have seen, is that in America, nobody gets free alone. Here I should make a confession. This talk was originally scheduled for November 17th. I asked to postpone it the day after the election. I had to postpone it because I was having the experience that I wrote about in Young Radicals, which is suddenly one day people wake up and they think, wait a second, what just happened to the country that I thought I knew? Do I still think the things I think are true? One of those young radicals, Walter Lippmann, who went on to become a very famous political columnist, looked back on those pre-war years and realized that what he had taken to be permanent progress was only, quote, a brief spell of exceptionally fine weather. What the young radicals taught me, unfortunately, is that change happens, but it's not always for the best. That the world can turn dark, and it can turn dark quickly. Alice Paul and her suffragists were staging peaceful pickets before the United States went into the war. But after the United States went into the war, those pickets looked like a threat to the commander-in-chief. And so these peaceful standing outside the White House with pennants turned into riots. They got arrested. They went on hunger strikes. She forced herself to be fed. Studying 1917, 1918, and 1919 is not a very cheerful exercise in a lot of ways. It's easy to lose heart. But Hamilton, for once, is informing the way I think about that book and that story. And I want to leave you with an incident, like a memory, something I saw in my time around Hamilton that I'm going to carry with me into whatever uncertainty is before all of us. On March 14th of this last year, Hamilton was invited by the Obamas to perform at the White House. It was the East Room, which I had just been writing about because the East Room was where Woodrow Wilson, who was the president when the United States went into the war, turned away that last delegation of suffragists before they took to the streets and started picketing and started suffering for their ideals. If you've been to the East Room, you know that the room is dominated by these huge portraits of George and Martha Washington, those iconic Gilbert Stuart portraits. They're 8 feet tall, they're enormous. From where I happened to be sitting, the portrait of George was directly behind the microphone that was at center stage, where the cast of Hamilton would perform like an hour's worth of material that day. Now, the portrait of George is not actually technically completely him. In 1796, he sat for Gilbert Stuart long enough for the artist to make an admirable likeness of his face. You can even kind of see the difficulty he was having with his teeth. But he didn't stay long enough for Stuart to get the rest of his body, or his hands, or even his posture, which is why Washington's step-grandson didn't think the portrait did him justice. It got his essence, though. And Stuart surrounded him with the right symbols. Those things didn't exist. He added those after Washington left. As Whitman would have said, this image was, quote, fit for the time. Now, I want you to picture what I saw that day. Directly between me and George Washington is another George Washington, which is Chris Jackson. He's the actor that created the role in the show on Broadway. There is no mistaking these people for being the same man. Chris Jackson is a black man from Cairo, Illinois. However, Chris has something about him that when you spend time with him, you hear yourself saying the things that people said when they were in Washington's presence back in the 18th century. You find yourself talking about his stature, his character. As Lynn put it, I'll censor slightly, Chris is just effing majestic. So these two Washingtons, one is in oil on the wall, silent, sort of him, but not exactly him. You've got another one in front of us who is not the actual man Washington, but carries some of his persona and is singing the actual words that Washington said in his farewell address. The closing song in that program was One Last Time, which you all raised your hands, is a song from Act 2 when Washington is stepping away from his power. I felt sitting there that I was looking at the range and the possibilities of American history without even having to turn my head. Because 6 feet in front of Chris, which is probably about 12 feet in front of George Washington, is Washington's successor, Barack Obama. In his inaugural address, Obama called himself, quote, "a man whose father less than 60 years ago might not have been served in a local restaurant." He's also a man about 150 years before that might have been owned by George Washington. To me, there's a lesson in this surprising little diorama about the 3 American presidents. It's not just how far we've come, it's not how much has changed, but how much it's always possible to change. That even now, America is still a thing in the making. And the reason why I feel confident about that is that sitting behind President Obama, over here, from my perspective, were about 100 students from area high schools. They were looking on and seeing the same thing that I was seeing. I don't know exactly what they were thinking, but I did some interviews about the students who came to the matinees at the Public Theater. And they said things like, for the first time, I feel like I belong in this country. They felt what the actors had felt, a connection to the story, a sense that they belong here. Here's what I think to be true. I think that ideas and beliefs and stories, in short, culture, have a deep power to change the world. I think that Hamilton is much closer to the beginning of making its power felt than it is to the end. I think that much of that effect is going to lie with kids like those kids who saw things like what I got to see. We know that in a few years, like every other successful Broadway musical, Hamilton is going to be licensed, so that it's not just that they get to see it, it's that they get to do it. Hundreds of schools every year are going to get the chance to put on Hamilton for themselves. That means 500 kids play George Washington, and another 500 play Angelica, and another 500 play Aaron Burr, and then the next year, another 500 get to play all those roles. The greatest impact the show is going to have, I think, is not even there. Not even when those kids have the experience that Leslie and David had when they were in the original production. It's that it's going to make them feel liberated to create something of their own. The palette of what is possible to do in theater is wider now than it was 3 years ago because of Hamilton. People can take more chances than they would have taken before, now that you can see it really is the crazy personal idea that sometimes has the biggest impact. I don't know what stories those kids are going to tell about their lives. I don't even know what kind of gadget they're going to express it on. I suspect maybe some of you do, like it's on a whiteboard somewhere. But to me, that's when the world changes. It's what those kids do based on what they've seen. The change that has been wrought in their view of the world, the kind that Whitman and Dr. King thought would happen. The world spins forward because they help us understand this country better. As Randolph Bourne said, quote, "as we understand each other more warmly." One of the things I admire most about Hamilton is that Lin doesn't make it easy. The founders, as he depicts them, aren't saints. They're not heroic, larger-than-life people. They're human, they're flawed, they make mistakes, they know they're screwing up. When Hamilton and Burr sing to their infant children about their hopes for America, they sing, "if we lay a strong enough foundation." It's never a sure thing. Even at the beginning, they knew that it might go wrong. All they could do was do their best. It was going to be a struggle, but a struggle means that we have a chance. That's the question, I guess, right now, is the foundation strong enough? You may be tempted to despair, but I can't say that I am. And I think if you are, look out your window. Here in the West Loop, buildings are going up everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and we'll run mics around the room. So who wants to start? We got one over here.
Hi, thank you so much. I loved seeing Hamilton and learning more about the story of him. and I'm now going to read Young Radicals now that you described it, and I'd just be interested.
The hip hop is much better in Hamilton. I don't want you to be-
Yeah, no, it's me. It's Turner. But I would love to know what similarities you see between the characters in Young Radicals and in Hamilton, and what motivated them to kind of lead the change that you saw.
Right. It's a great question. There's a paradox about people who really commit their lives to changing the world, right? Because the kind of change that they want isn't always a change that's going to make any difference in their lives. So if there was a particular kind of personality I wanted to understand when I wrote Young Radicals. I thought of it as a kind of experiment in people who try to change the world. To make the experiment good, I had to find people who didn't have to do what they did. They could have led very comfortable lives if they decided just to stick around their college campuses and teach, or go work in a bank or something, and they didn't. Instead, they suffered physical harm in many cases to try to make the world better. I think there is a kind of zeal that you need to have. There's a sense of injustice that needs to be corrected that seems to me a powerful motivator, whether the change that you want to make is political or economic, whether there's a cultural wrong that you're trying to right. The zeal isn't exactly the same in culture, but what I have noticed about Lin and hearing these songs develop is that you either hear the voices or you don't. And Lin plainly does. I mean, a guy who can write My Shot, which, okay, fine, young person, My Shot, that makes sense. But you can also write Burn and It's Quiet Uptown, and that would be enough. I mean, there are these experiences, this ability to imagine the position of somebody else that is underneath the kind of change you want to see politically and socially, and underneath your ability to inhabit those lives and bring them to life in imaginative literature of one kind or another. Good question. Are there questions? Yeah, Alex, superstar Alex. Another round of applause for Alex.
What advice would you give to someone like me or of my generation who want to make a change but aren't really sure how to start, especially in theater, because theater is becoming such a big, really
Right.
important thing?
Well, part of it, like I said, is that if you do theater, if you are an artist, you're changing the world. You're changing the way people feel, and maybe it's subtle. They're not all, number 1 and 2 on the rap chart this week, but there is some effect there. So I would say that it is a way of serving the society. It's what Dr. King said, In terms of the advice I would give, I've always thought that the actors who fare the best are the ones who are the broadest. There are people who have some broad interest in what's going on around them. It just feels to me this is based on nothing, but that they bring more into their work when they get in a rehearsal room, even if it's not a direct connection between the two. And then in terms of the mechanics of the profession, just buckle down. It takes a long time. I mean, these guys, it took these guys a long time to catch their breaks in that original company. And they're very grateful that they stuck around. Obviously, now they're all becoming stars, but it's a tough life. But, look at you. You were great. Walt Whitman. You made Walt Whitman sing. Come on. Broadway's not ready. Is there another question?
I have the mic, so I'll ask you one.
Yes, go for it.
I've been thinking about this because in the mixtape, there's that fabulous song, Congratulations, that wasn't in the show. And it says Jefferson's doing good, basically, because he doesn't justify every schoolyard taunt with a response. And it made me think about our president-elect's power user status on Twitter. So you've watched the people inhabit these characters and study these characters, and I wonder what you think Hamilton would have been like if he had access to Twitter.
God, he would have been a disaster. Oh my God, he wouldn't have even made it as long as he made it in real life. he had no filter. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Lin felt that he would be such a good character for a musical, because he was so passionate. Like he couldn't stop himself once he got going. The same forces that led him out of his blighted island life to try to make something for himself to succeed are the same things that led to his destruction, because he didn't know how to shut it off. I think he would almost certainly have had his account blocked. I mean, Lin takes comfort, I think, in knowing, as he said in interviews, that, it's always been ugly in American politics. It's not like the 1790s where, philosophers sitting around and arguing about first principles. They had egos. They had agendas. Some people liked each other and some people didn't. They were very human. And to me, I think one of the secrets of this show's success is that it's easier for us to see ourselves, because that's what we're all like, too. Any questions? Yes.
Great talk.
Thanks.
So quick question. You've been involved with this for a long time, hugely popular, once-in-a-lifetime kind of thing. What's been the best part?
The best part, I'm glad you asked, Ted. The best part was first preview at the Public Theater. This is the first real public performance of the show, the full show, anyone's ever seen. I'm sorry, no. It was opening night. It was the first opening night of the show, the first real production. And at intermission, the house lights come up, and I turn to my wife to see how this is going, and she turns to me, and she says, "Oh, now I see why you've been talking about this show for all these years." So that, to me, that's it. That's one thing, and there's another thing. This book, Lin and I dedicated this book to our children, to my daughter and to his son. In fact, if you want to know, the dedication page is the most perfectly collaborative thing in the entire book, because I said to him, we should dedicate this to our kids, and he's the one that came up with the perfect way to do it, with that line that he picked. I did a signing at the Public Theater in New York. There was a kind of Q&A, and then I went over and sat on the banquette, and my daughter, who's now 4, was there that night. And I carried her over to the banquette, and I thought it would be fun for her to sit down and hold the books open while I signed them. And some, saintly woman whose name I'll never know was in the line and saw her sitting there and knew that the book was dedicated to her. And so when she got to the front of the line, she asked my daughter, "Would you sign this too?" And so she's 3 at the time, so she can barely, hold a Sharpie, but she goes like this. So then for 10 minutes, I would sign the book and slide it across the table, and she would sign the book, and then someone would hand it to the people. So we have one picture of that happening. And again, the fun of this is going to be years from now when I can show her that, and I'll say, "Do you have any memory of this? Remember when you got to hang out backstage at Hamilton? What that feels like?" I don't think she will, but I will. So. Back there.
Hi, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure.
I think we're a young company. Most people here have only been in the workforce during an Obama presidency, but we still have work to get done. As a company, we do, and as a country, we do. How do you balance, through your lens of your work, when to fight and when to cut deals to make progress?
That's a great and really hard question. And it's a question that, all of these guys I'm writing about in the 19-teens, Alice Paul, Randolph Bourne, Max Eastman, John Reed, Walter Lippmann, they all have these gut check moments. The reason why the 19-teens were so much fun to write about is because huge world historical events were coming along every 18 months for some reason. And Randolph Bourne, who, in addition to being the prophet of transnational America, was also an outspoken critic of the war. He was a pacifist. And so he wrote this series of essays that weren't just about saying why it was a mistake for us to go to war, but also saying, if you oppose the war, what's the right way to do it? And he saw that there are some forms of opposition to the war that make it worse. You will just be as caught up in it as anybody else. And he said that there is a way of sticking to what you believe in, forcing the war to break in on you instead of going out to meet it, and trying to pursue the ideals that were important to you before the war came along anyway. Because he said that for some people, the war has renewed their sense of what they value most about American life. It was a very different situation in 1917, but I think it applies.
I think we have time for one last question.
So I think one problem that a lot of us are having to deal with right now is seeing politics as just this, it has never been this dirty, it has never been this ugly, but like you were saying, it actually has been. It's just that now we have a platform for that. But still, it seems very just unbelievable to be watching what's happening. And I wonder how much of that is just because we as kids were taught about these are the end results, and we just don't see how things come about. And I was wondering if you thought that shedding more light on the history and on the people that actually brought this country into being would change any of that, would help us see, no, it actually has been ugly all the time.
Yeah. Recovering the sense that it could have gone wrong, I think, is one of the best things that the show has done. Like, they didn't, it wasn't there waiting for them to find victory on the battlefield or a, federated constitutional republic, bigger by orders of magnitude than anything that had been tried in world history before. They talked a lot in the Revolutionary era, and again in the era of the Young Radicals, in fact, about experiment, that they were experimenting. They were trying to see if it would work. I think, in a sense, the stakes of the experiment have gone up lately. I mean, the inputs have changed. I don't know what it's going to do to the outcome of the experiment. I wish that I did. But all I can say is what Randolph Bourne said in that essay, I think, is true. There's a way that the enormity of the question and the fear that we feel guarantees that it turns out badly. I think the lesson of how hard those guys fought, Hamilton and his friends at the beginning, these young radicals in the 19-teens, thousands of activists and patriots, people who are dedicated to American democracy now, do the good that you can do with other people, and it gives us our best chance to come through this. That's as far as I've gotten so far.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.